Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. I'm the Vicar of St Matthew's Church. I'm the host of the Godcast. I'm a member of the Church of England General Synod, and I am the author of Our Daily Bread from Argos to the Altar. Do check that out. My guest on the Godcast this week is a journalist who spent many years working for the BBC, covering places such as Northern Ireland, Israel, across the world, really. But can have a good chat with him about his career and some politics. So I hope you enjoy this interview now with Mark Devonport. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is political commentator, broadcaster, journalist Mark Devonport. Mark, it's really great to get you on the Godcast. How are you?
I'm very well, and thanks for inviting me on, Alex.
It's a pleasure. It's great to get you on. Let's just before we get down to some politics, Mark, and explore some of your expertise, a little bit about yourself. I always think it's nice to just look at the person behind the camera a little bit, or the broadcasting. What was the teenage years like for a young Mark Devonport? Was there political conversations going on around the breakfast table? What was it like for you?
Definitely, I was in one of those houses where politics and the news very much dominated conversations. I remember, my dad or my mum would be at the bottom of the stairs, and this was obviously in the era before social media. And when you were coming up to a news bulletin, people would shout "news" at the top of their voice, and everybody would kind of pile down to see what the latest was. We grew up actually in Oxford. I'm English originally, and I was one of four children. I grew up in a strongly Catholic household. I think, I saw things to do with Northern Ireland, which is where I made most of my career as being a kind of complete world apart. A sort of certain degree of curiosity because there was the thing about Catholics and Protestants. And I thought, what on earth is this about? But if you'd said to me in my teenage years, would you become a journalist? I'd say yes, because I was always into that kind of thing. I was editing the school magazine and keen to write essays on anything. But if you'd said to me, "Oh, you're going to spend most of your professional career in Northern Ireland," I'd say, "No way. I think you got the wrong guy."
Mm. And was the Catholic Protestant issue being talked about in Oxford? Or was it kind of it's a them problem rather than an our problem?
Well, as I say, the family was strongly Catholic. For instance, I had an aunt who was a Salesian nun, a missionary. We actually had a house that we rented from a convent next door to us, a convent full of nuns. We had a convent on one side and a pub on the other, so we used to joke that all needs were catered for. So Catholicism was there, but we were one of those families that was definitely very English. We didn't kind of think of ourselves as Irish, even though if you went back a couple of generations, that was what our origins were. But our family had come over in the 19th century on both sides of my family and had got work in England. In my dad's case, his family got work in the coal mines in the northeast of England. And in my mum's case, she actually was born in Barlick. You probably know that well. Some people would know it as Barnoldswick. And
Mm.
they got work in the linen mills. And so they came across, but by the time I came along in 1961, we were completely integrated. And whilst there was quite an Irish side to parish life in our bit of Oxford, it was over by the car factory rather than the university. We didn't ever think of ourselves as Irish. And so, as I say, there was this thing going on in the news involving Catholics and Protestants, but otherwise, it wasn't really anything in terms of like religious division. But
Mm.
obviously, religion was part and parcel. I went to a Catholic primary school. But then there was a kind of a reorganization of education around Oxford, and I ended up going to a state secondary school. And I remember that my rather devout parents were all concerned about what would happen, without me getting that kind of religious instruction that my brothers had got because they'd gone to a Catholic grammar school, which had closed.
Yeah.
So they were a bit concerned about that. But really, most of my friends, weren't half so actively religious. And
Mm.
I ended up, I suppose, rebelling and kind of losing religion during the teenage years. Just kind of didn't see it as part of my makeup particularly.
Yeah, I was going to be my next question actually. Were you kind of happy to attend church and mass and things like that, or how did that evolve? You've just suggested you turned away from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of looking back on it, I maybe it's the usual thing of kind of rebelling against the law that's laid down to you. And also, I mean, one thing was that my parents were massively into education. They saw that as kind of the ladder to get forward, and they would encourage debate, whether it was about politics or whatever. So in a way, I suppose they kind of like were responsible a little bit for the fact that their children all became kind of free thinkers one way or the other. And so I suppose that was a decision that I made because I kind of intellectually didn't really see there being anything sort of outside, if you like, the this particular physical world. Um, but at the same time, sometimes I kind of think I'm still kind of culturally Catholic because there is something that still lives with you. You know, my dad was the head of the SVP, the St Vincent de Paul Society in the parish, which is a sort of charitable society, and we kind of grew up with knocks on the door from people who needed help. And as I say, I had an aunt who was a nun,
Yeah.
and that's kind of it's meant that I've had an abiding interest in religion, even if I wouldn't see myself as a believer.
That's really interesting. I've had numerous lapsed Catholics who've been on the podcast and have said, you know what, there is an element of once a Catholic, always a Catholic, and I suppose there's some truth in that. Would you agree?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I think certainly it kind of makes you worry about things and get guilty about things when you do things that you shouldn't do. Gives you kind of moral sense. And I mean, I also went, I suppose, I went through that kind of teenage period of being kind of like radically atheist and this is all a load of rubbish. But at later stages in life, I think I've kind of grown to have, if you like, a more appreciative view. I mean, there was one time I remember after I'd graduated from university where I got involved in campaigning for a local Oxfam group. I was big into third world development at that stage. And I noticed that it was often the people of professed religious belief who actually put in the hard yards and did the work and actually performed the charitable work. And it was all very well just sort of talking about things, but actually that kind of commitment gave you, if you like, that kind of
Yeah.
extra push in life. So I mean, I take the view that there's good and bad atheists, there's good and bad religious people, and you take people as you find them. But
Yeah.
I'm happy enough to even now I go along together with my wife and my father-in-law who are more active participants in their church and sort of partake in some of the sort of church-related activities. And I don't see that as being terribly hypocritical. I just think it's one of those other kind of communal organizations in
Yeah.
society. And if it's good, doing good, then that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about your journey to be a fully signed up member of the journalist fraternity? Mark, was that clear and you knew exactly where you were heading? Just share a bit about that journey to get in the first gig, as it were.
Well, I think, when I was at school, I was always very keen on that. I went to a comprehensive school in Oxford, and all I could think about, I was editing the school magazine. All I could think about was maybe getting into the local paper and being a cub reporter, and then I'd have been happy doing that. But actually, my local paper, the Oxford Mail and Times, at that stage when I wrote off to them, said, no work experience, no trips around the office. We're completely booked up and kind of basically completely blocked me. So I went off to university and I probably didn't do as much student journalism as I should have done to try and get in. I did do some kind of bits and pieces when I was beginning to panic about what am I going to do about a career afterwards, but not as much probably as would have been advisable. But I was quite lucky because having been turned down from a lot of the training schemes, I saw this job advert for a department in the World Service, which was defying all the usual kind of recruiting systems at that stage, which is instead of going through the kind of BBC training system and all of that, they were saying basically, we want you to put in one example of writing and we will judge you on that. And I had done a piece actually about the film about Gandhi, which had just come out, Richard Attenborough. And it happened to be one of my special subjects at university in Cambridge was Gandhi and Indian politics. And I put in this thing, which was half a film review and half a kind of criticism of what was or wasn't right about the film. And the guy liked it, brought me in, and the rest is history. I got a temporary job there, and that then led on to other things.
Yeah. And the island gig, Mark, was that something you were actively pursuing, or just tell us how that came about?
It was a complete accident. I had I had an interest in Ireland, as I say, I suppose maybe because of being brought up a Catholic in England and seeing things on the news, I had a bit of an interest in it. And I remember sort of doing discussions about the situation in Ireland and Northern Ireland when I was at university. But then I got onto the BBC News training scheme. And what used to happen is you would be sent around for 3 months here, 3 months there in different parts of the corporation. And there was a fair bit of competition, I think, to go to Belfast because it was a kind of a hard news area at that stage. And I just, because I maybe didn't have a lot of push at that particular point, I wasn't part of that competition. I was quite happy to go to a region in southern England where they could actually fully rehearse the evening news earlier in the afternoon because nothing particularly breaking ever happened. It was all nice features that were planned in advance. And I was on the point of doing that. And then I got a call from the course instructor to say the girl who was due to be going to Belfast for various personal reasons couldn't go. And could I get on the next plane? And so it was entirely accidental, really, that I ended up over there. But I took to it, and they took to me. So we got a job coming up, and the rest is history.
And that was it 20 odd years you ended up being there?
Yeah, well, it was kind of like the mid 1980s when I went out there as a trainee. First of all in '86, and then I came back and got a sort of proper job in '87. I've had most of my career then since then. I had a couple of years when I was based in New York. I did a job as BBC United Nations correspondent, but then I came back to Ireland and ended up becoming the political editor at Stormont. So most of my career has been there.
You just got me thinking about travel there, Mark, as you were talking. I've been very fortunate that I've been to places such as the Holy Land, and I've been to Auschwitz, and I've been to Northern Ireland and the Republic a number of times. Northern Ireland is a place that's kind of got right under my skin. I don't know if that surprises you at all, but I wonder within that 20-year career, Mark, there, whether you just I suppose the question I want to ask is, what were the real lows during that time, and maybe what was the ultimate kind of story that gave you some hope for that place, if you could explain that for me.
Those are big questions. I mean, sadly, I saw quite a lot of lows as things at various stages. I mean, I was around in West Belfast. I didn't witness it, but I was sent shortly after it to that incident where the two corporals were killed in West Belfast. That was a grim, grim time, which came after we'd already had an attack in Milltown Cemetery by the loyalist Michael Stone and so on, and then this killing of the two corporals. So that was a grim period where people thought, is the clock going to go back to the worst days of the 70s? And also a particularly grim time for me, I think, would have been around the time of the Omagh bombing, because we had had the promise of peace and a referendum in which the peace deal had been endorsed, and then you got this terrible bomb that went off that killed 29 people, including the mother of unborn children. And most of the time, when I was being a sort of a reporter and commentator, I was always telling myself, you've got to kind of step back and not get too involved in this. But I remember after the Omagh bombing, that I went along to a service that took place in Belfast, and I went along not as a reporter, but just as a member of the community. So it had affected me so much that I did that. At the other time, in terms of highs, I mean, I've had some great times from the get-go. And the first weekend that I arrived in Northern Ireland, I didn't know anyone, but my brother, who'd been to Manchester University, said, "I'll phone up my mate Terence, and he'll maybe be able to show you around." And I have to say, his friend Terence McKee, who is now sadly no longer with us, picked me up from the airport, took me to Mid-Digs, and on the first weekend I was there, took me for a drive along the Antrim coast, which I had been totally unaware of, which is one of the most gorgeous coastlines that you could ever come across. And early on in the time in Northern Ireland, I remember seeing the Antrim coast, seeing the gorgeous times there, and then ending up in the uh, workshop and garden shed of a guy called Jim McKillop, who was a traditional fiddle maker who made Irish fiddles. And there we were with him showing off his fiddles, which he could play brilliantly. He's a great violinist, sipping Bushmills whiskey with cheese and tomato sandwiches. And I thought, well, where else would you want to be?
Yeah,
Yeah, there's
lovely.
been many great times. And of course, now we've got peace. Nothing can be taken for granted. But in parallel with getting peace, then I've also, met my wife here, got a family here,
Yeah.
and that's all incredible. And I couldn't have predicted that certainly when I was a teenager in Oxford.
When you were in the thick of it, when you around those times of the Omar bombings and the constant concern and worry about attacks here, there, and everywhere, could you could you foresee a time of peace where you kind of thinking this it just ain't gonna happen? Because I think there's some real parallels. I mean, my children and certainly a lot of the children that I take assemblies for are living in a very fragile world, aren't they? And but I remember growing up, Northern Ireland was always the big news, and it was very much on my doorstep and our everybody's doorstep in the UK and beyond even. And I thinking, will this ever end? Were you in that kind of mindset as well?
I think certainly in that initial few years when I was there, at that stage, the unionists were enraged about something called the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which had been a deal signed between London and Dublin in the mid-80s. And they were angry. The IRA campaign was still carrying on at its height. And it did have that sort of sense that this was just going to go on and on. And you say it was sort of like top of the news. The sad fact was that it wasn't top of the news in that period because almost people had just got used to the fact that that's what happens, and okay, there's an occasional bomb in England. So it wasn't really until I think after Margaret Thatcher left and after we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, you started seeing slowly but surely some people saying, well, if things big can change in terms of the Berlin Wall, in terms of South Africa and so on, maybe things can change closer to home. And then at that stage, I was a current affairs reporter on TV in Belfast, and I started kind of getting some sense when we started having some short-lived Christmas ceasefires and so on that there were maneuvers going on behind the scenes.
Mm.
I remember I was, as I say, on the Spotlight TV current affairs program, and I said to them, "Look, there's this guy called Clinton who's standing for election in the U.S. presidency, and he's making some promises about, maybe giving Jerry Adams a visa, maybe doing something in relation to Northern Ireland. I think we should be doing something on that." And at that stage, my editor said, "No, this happens with every U.S. election. They make
Mm.
promises to lobby groups, nothing ever comes of it. It'd be very expensive to go to America. I think we got to stick to closer to home." And then nearer the time, I think that was, what was it, 93, or it would have been, or 92 anyway, early 90s when Clinton was coming to power. Nearer the time, the program that was due to start our run fell through completely for various kind of legal reasons. And the editor came to me and said, that American idea, how quickly and how cheaply could you jack that up? And that's how I ended up over in America doing Clinton's inauguration and getting hold of the video, which hadn't been shown before in Europe, of him making these promises. And
Yeah.
even I, at that stage, I think my conclusions were, well, he probably won't, make that much of a difference. But It was one only one bit, but it was one bit in the jigsaw that did make a difference.
Yeah. And when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, Mark, were you caught up in the euphoria? Were you mildly cynical? What was your emotions and thoughts at that point?
Well, I think I was caught up very much because I was kind of living it 24 hours a day, literally in the sense of the Good Friday Agreement, because we were working around the clock. So I was caught up in, the importance of the moment. But at the same stage, I knew at that stage I was BBC Ireland correspondent. I was going to have to explain things to the national and to the international audiences. And I would always, in my reporting, sort of take a step back. You couldn't become a kind of campaigner for one side or the other. It would be kind of easy, particularly when we went into a referendum, to say, oh, the peace, that must be good. Saying no to this deal, that must be bad. But that wasn't my job. There were people who were against, for instance, the Good Friday Agreement in the referendum campaign, who have valid concerns. If you had a loved one who was killed in the Troubles and you were about to see their killer released early from jail, you could understand
Mm,
in relation to if it was your family, my family, that would be hard to stomach. So I suppose it was also being, BBC rather than newspapers that you had to kind of do a little bit of I'm going to approach this on the one hand and on the other. And I do remember kind of having a discussion with a Labour minister who came over with Tony Blair that time saying, think you're giving too much to Ian Paisley, giving too much to Bob McCartney. And I said, well, I
mm,
think, when you examine the opinion polls, we're pretty much in line with what they're saying,
mm,
which was ultimately it got more than 70% or of a vote in Northern Ireland. But there were valid reasons why some people weren't ready for a deal at that stage.
mm. And what's your assessment of the country now, Mark? I mean, I've been a few times and I've done the tourist things. I've got on the double-decker bus and gone round and thought this is all,
You
Belfast.
might have been guided by my daughter, who's now over in England. But when she
Oh,
was at university, that was her summer job,
oh,
was to be a
really?
double decker
That's a nice story.
guide.
Yeah, and it was. I was about to say, and it was lovely, and it was wonderful. But then, if you step back a little bit, it's a bit like walking on the promenade at Blackpool. Everything's shiny, and you take two steps back, and you see the realities. Is it fair to say there is like a fragile tension there still? And is it more about um, a debate around Republicans and Unionists and less about Catholics and Protestants?
Yeah, well, certainly I know some people, my wife included, who gets enraged when people kind of use those terms. Catholic must mean Republican and Protestant must mean Unionist, and it's absolutely true that the truth is more complex than that, and that you don't necessarily uh, have to have one political view because you've grown up in one community or another. But I suppose religion is, if you like, one of those kind of cultural markers alongside things like language, where you're essentially talking about different groups that came from different origins and have a bit of an argument about what should happen to this piece of territory. And you kind of see that in various other conflicts. In terms of what it's like now, obviously much improved from the dark days when I was reporting on daily killings. Um, but as you say, there's a degree of fragility to it because no one quite knows what the future of the place will be. We're caught in some of the kind of headwinds that affect all sorts of different parts of Western Europe. There's not enough cash to go around. There's still, a lot of deprivation. And we've seen in recent years, sadly, because they many of them provide a sort of vital function for our society. Sadly, a diversion into kind of the racism that we've seen in other areas, and the small ethnic communities in Northern Ireland have been targeted in some violence, quite horrendously. So, there's still a lot of work to be done, and unfortunately, whilst we have made progress. I think what has happened around the world, you mentioned the Middle East, shows that nothing can be taken for granted.
Mm. And just on the Middle East, Mark, I often wonder if um, the model of Ireland is a way forward for the rest of the world, such as the Holy Land. Am I being romantically naive there, do you think, or is there something within that that could be transferable?
Well, I don't think that any kind of like one situation can be kind of transferred directly onto another because there's all sorts of different dynamics and personalities at play. But what I do think is quite important to conflict resolution is being able for the sort of participants, the leading characters in one area, to look and see what potentially they can take from that area in order to try and lead them towards a better future. So, it's incredibly sad that the Oslo peace process has fractured in the way it has done in the Middle East, and there's been this awful loss of life. And at the moment, there's no sign of any kind of light at the end of the tunnel. But certainly, I went to the Middle East and saw it with my own eyes. Went to Gaza, just filling in at one point for Jeremy Bowen way back in I think it was in 1998. I had a couple of months there. But I also went to South Africa, where some Northern Ireland politicians journeyed there, and they were able to sort of pass on some of what they've done in terms of South Africa, in terms of the transition there. So none of these places are analogous, and it would be naive to say, oh, yeah, you can simply transfer one to the other. But I think particularly when you've got intractable problems, it's useful to maybe talk to people who've also been through intractable problems and maybe found a route to compromise. And that can be, to some extent, maybe about just the spirit of compromise, but also there can be logistical things in terms of weapons disarmament and so on, and the treatment of language rights, various things that maybe have echoes in different other areas. So I think you've got to kind of treat it sort of in that kind of mature way.
Yeah. And what's your take on the world political stage, Mark? I mean, it seems absolutely crackers at the moment, doesn't it? Particularly with a particular president kind of changing direction every time the wind changes direction. What what does that what does that mean to countries like Ireland, in the whole? Where I'm sure you've saw the speech by Mark Carney. I was intrigued. If people haven't watched it, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, spoken this week about kind of almost like what it's like being the smaller of the nations. What's your view on perhaps what he said and in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think sadly we probably moved beyond a situation now where the kind of rule of international law can be taken for granted. And, therefore, I suppose smaller nation states have to be kind of mindful of how they go about their destiny. I mean, partly that may be rearmament, and it's sort of unfortunate that in terms of, like, say, Western Europe, if we will have to devote a lot more cash to that when there are so many other problems that also need financial resources. But it may well be that we can't take these for granted. That we need to be a bit more self-reliant. Whether it's Canada, whether it's Western Europe, whether it's Ireland, I can see what world leaders are trying to do. They're trying to handle Trump, a bit like an unexploded bomb, carrying him very carefully around the place. And that is because of the integration of both the sort of the military side of the West and the great integration of the economic side of the West. That
Mm,
nobody wants to kind of you can do the sort of defiant speech that would go down well in a Hollywood movie, but then where will you be the next day?
mm,
And in a way, I almost feel sorry for Keir Starmer because he's trying to do the mature thing whilst realizing that probably politically with his own grassroots, there's not a lot of thanks for that. But it's a fragile world. It has always been a fragile world, and maybe to some extent we were living in a fool's paradise because any kind of system of international law is always underpinned by naked power,
mm,
and that's been the case in the past, and it sadly looks like it might be the case in the future.
mm. Yeah, well, we'll see, won't we? And Mark, I've really enjoyed this. This half an hour has absolutely flown by. I did just want to get a thought or two on the BBC, if that's all right. They fed you for many years,
Yes, yeah.
and I wondered, just having a few years away from it and looking at them now, what you see. I mean, I've done numerous journalistic things with them, and I've always found them to be very courteous and professional, and they're still my go-to news network. But as somebody who's been in the institution for a number of years, how do you look at them from your comfortable place there at your lovely home?
I mean, as you say, that I am a product of the BBC, and they've given me incredible opportunities to travel the world and report from interesting places. And, you know, all the editors that I've dealt with have always been motivated by, trying to get to the truth of a story, trying to expose things that are important or need exposing for one way or the other, either exposing or indeed just explaining to the wider audience. And I see them continuing that work now. Now, like all institutions, they make mistakes. For instance, that panorama over Trump. Most of us think, how on earth did that edit get through, or whatever? And that will be the case in the future. Um, I am not sure in the future how long the license fee will be sustainable, because obviously it comes from an era when the BBC was, the only provider, and now we're in a completely different sort of broadcast and webcast universe with so many different providers. But I do kind of think of the Joni Mitchell the song Big Yellow Taxi, if you know that
I
one.
do.
Don't it always seem to go that you don't really know what you've got till it's gone? And
Yeah.
if the critics of the BBC get their way and tear this thing down, it will not only be the BBC missing, but it'll be, if you like, a kind of magnetic force which has also exerted that influence on other broadcasters and kind of promoted high standard broadcasting, high standard public service television and radio. So I would like to think that in the future, that maybe with some sort of hybrid of a license fee and subscription, or of a license fee and advertising,
Mm.
that the BBC can continue doing the vital work it does. I mean, I've met people around the world who have spoken to me about how important, particularly the BBC World Service and its foreign language services have been to them. I mean, we've seen it's a lifeline to many people in Iran. I remember going to Sierra Leone when that place was in turmoil. I was doing a documentary about conflict diamonds, and it was kind of interesting in as much as nobody particularly recognized me. But when I had to hand my passport over for various checks, because I've been a radio broadcaster so far as Sierra Leone was concerned, this was when I was a United Nations correspondent, I would have been one of the main voices they would hear. And I saw the passport, and then they go, "Are you that Mark Devonport?" And then they listen to the voice, and you suddenly realize you're making a difference to people, in all sorts of parts of the
Yeah.
world that you maybe didn't think about. And that's an important part of the UK's influence. So, I hope that, there'll continue to be a good future for it. I think it's a positive for the UK. And that's without being sort of starry-eyed and not recognizing that it hasn't made lots of mistakes and will continue to do so. And I suppose a bit like we began this discussion with me talking about religion and faith. The BBC, it's one of those things. Part of the charter is that it will be impartial, and I think I'm a little bit like in relation to Catholicism. I kind of think impartiality is a great idea. I'm not sure it actually exists, but it's maybe good to work towards it and try and put yourself in the kind of sphere of how would license fee payers with very different views to mine look upon this, and then try and come up with a way of explaining it that's valuable to them.
I think you need to come and join the General Synod in the Church of England. We could do with some of that wisdom there, that's for sure. But Mark, I've really enjoyed chatting to you. I'm really grateful for your time, and I hope people have enjoyed this. If they do, there's lots of journalists and people from media, including Eamon Holmes, who it was the very first podcast that we did, and lots of journalists as well. But Mark, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
And I hope the cough gets better.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Alex.